Pat, I'd like to talk a little bit with you about the relationship between religion and literature, and I'd like to focus on the moral dimension of literature and religion. I'm thinking in general about this interaction between these two very different disciplines which come together in some ways. I know there's a period in the past when religion and literature have seemed to be very much at odds. In fact, I think we can go back all the way in for negative attitudes towards literature, towards poetry, back into the time of Plato and the Republic. Plato was not too thrilled about having poets in his ideal society, feeling that they would keep people from following the dictates of the philosopher king. And so there has been what I often call a sort of suspicious attitude existing between the two disciplines, and I wonder if we could explore that a little bit for a while.
Okay, fine. I think I'd like to say, though, Jim, that Plato's attitude was not necessarily, certainly not the only attitude. Aristotle disagreed with him. And I'm not sure it's been the dominant attitude, although there's a strain of it that runs into our own time. And we see this reflected in the efforts, for instance, of parents to get such naughty books as Catcher in the Rye banned from school curricula, or the book Huckleberry Finn, for instance, because of its use of the word nigger, or because of the mockery it seems to make of traditional religious behavior and mores. So I guess I would begin by saying that at times they've been antithetical, but probably more often, until very recent times, they have been good buddies, and in a sense literature was birthed in religion and in religious belief.
What about the fundamentalist approach these days, when you start to get a cross-fertilization of the two disciplines, theology and literary criticism? Very often the people who want to defend the Bible and are worried that its inerrancy will be challenged are not open really to literary approaches to the scriptures very often. That would be an example of the flow goes the other way. Here's this world of literary criticism that says let's look at the purpose of the author, or let's look at the historical context in which it was written, or let's find out what literary forms are involved in a particular book of the Bible. All of that line of thought really seems to be an unfriendly attack is viewed that way by many fundamentalist Christians. So it seems to me that's another area of suspicion that really has arisen again with great strength in our own time.
Oh, I would have to give you that, Jim. You're absolutely correct. And at least from my somewhat limited experience, it's the fundamentalists who will tend to take umbrage with, for instance, the new as they see moral laxity reflected both in contemporary literature and in contemporary movies and contemporary television programs, for instance, the vulgar language, often the sexual promiscuity, the violence, etc. So I think you're absolutely right in suggesting that there are certain groups within society, probably at any time, who look with a certain suspicion or, if not hostility, toward literature. But on the other hand, the fundamentalists would be certainly in sync with a lot of the Oxford scholars of the Victorian era who saw literature as, in a sense, the replacement for religion, which was in a decline from the writings of Darwin and others, and who felt that it was a repository of values and that, in a sense, it would save the people because religion itself was seen as being in a state of decline.
Well, wouldn't you, therefore, you would say, could turn it around and say, yeah, that's why religious people feared it, because they would be saying something like, well, these people are coming on our turf. I mean, they're masquerading as a religion. You've got literary critics like Matthew Arnold thinking that poetry should substitute for religion, that should be our guidance in life. And so, I mean, I can see on the part of the theologians or church people, again, a lot of fear that this is going to take over, and they're not going to recognize the importance of the teachings of Christ and of the Bible and of what the church has to say. So I know, as I'm saying, is there's again a sharp edge, it seems to me, in the conflict between the two, creating a bit of that suspicion again.
Well, even a fairly current and highly respected literary critic such as Northrop Frye said that we should find in literature a spiritual home, a place where the spirit could be at rest and could be nurtured and could be nourished. And no one would accuse him probably of being a strong moralist. I guess the conflict is rooted in the fact that so much very early literature did in fact have a moral purpose. That is, it was to present models for imitation. Heroes, for instance, who overcame difficulties. Heroes who were honest when it would have been easier not to be honest. And that literature, much literature, was written with a didactic purpose, with the intent of giving a different kind of pleasure from that often found in theological tomes or reading the Summa Theologica, for instance, straight on with its abstract formulations and rather formidable language.
So that's a really good point, I think, then, that one of the things that the literature can do, or has traditionally been seen to do, is to sort of bring out moral values, to suggest ways of living, to bring us into flesh and blood individuals who exemplify particular Christian virtues. And then I think the other point that I was getting out of what you said is that when literature takes a different turn then in more recent times, and the heroes don't look so great, and their behavior really is exemplifying more vice than virtue, now religious people begin to wonder what is happening. Is this really undercutting what we are all about? And I think, did you mention Catcher in the Rye before? Did that just vibrate in my mind?
No, I did mention it.
Yeah,
yes,
Catcher in the Rye,
yes.
Holden Caulfield. I mean, wasn't that, again, an example of the kind of literature that people began to fear? In other words, here you have a kind of protagonist, a hero person, I guess, who doesn't hold all the values or live out the kind of lifestyle that people would like to see, and therefore people say, well, we don't want the kids reading that. That will corrupt the youth. It's the same charge Plato made against Socrates in his Republic. I mean, Socrates going around corrupting the youth as he's asked them all these hard questions. Well, in a sense, here you got the modern literature posing these dilemmas and putting maybe even in a favorable light behavior that parents don't want passed on to their young people.
Oh, you're correct about that. For instance, you'll be disturbed, I'm sure, to know that Holden Caulfield did not like sports. And he couldn't understand why the students at his prep school were
that does it. I mean, we can't be reading books like that.
Football game.
Yeah.
But he was also, in a lot of ways, he was counterculture. He didn't do what was expected. He didn't follow the rules. He didn't follow the rules, and yet he expresses himself with such charming candor that he does indeed become a figure that the reader tends to identify with, find engaging, charming, and possibly then could be led to imitate. And you're right, that's the dilemma. The dilemma, I suppose, of the attractive anti-hero or even the attractive villain. To the degree that we like them, we might want to imitate their behavior, their antisocial behavior.
Perhaps we could say that Holden Caulfield then represents the Christian virtue of epikeia, which is the virtue that tells you how and when to break the rules, and what situation. Maybe we could turn it around and say, here's a man who represents a particular virtue, one espoused by Thomas Aquinas, the virtue of epikeia, a Greek word which suggests this ability to prudence, to know when to break the rules. But
Holden would be happy to hear that, I'm sure.
Yes, right. But this is an ongoing problem. I mean, how do you tell parents that about having their young people read literature like this? I mean, what sort of argument do you make? Or say at the collegiate level you're teaching students and they sort of come from a puritanical background or Catholic moralistic background, and they're saying, well, we shouldn't be reading things like this. It's tempting, or it's enticing, or seductive, and so on. What do you say to people like that who have that complaint against, I suppose, much of modern literature?
Well, I might quote John Milton, "I cannot praise a fugitive and captive virtue, unexercised and unbreathed." That is, his point was that until somehow we grapple with temptation, we are not really capable of practicing virtue, that virtue always comes in a deliberate choice when there are options open to us, and that the morality of being led like sheep where it is not possible to take an alternative course of action is not really morality at all. It's only sheep behavior and conformity.
So there would be something, in other words, you'd be arguing that, well, it is more adult to have looked at real life, to have faced the moral dilemmas, and to recognize that there are options, and then out of that sort of deeper understanding, one would hope one chooses a more constructive behavior. Maybe would it be true to say that a lot of times in literature what happens is that when we see the protagonist or various characters in the story acting in immoral ways, that at times at least one can see that that is not very positive or doesn't work well, or it leads to bad consequences? I mean, certainly sometimes you see that in literature. I'm not saying all the time, but that could be part of an argument, not so?
That's right. That's right. Certainly, I think we can make the strong case for studying works of literature, because in the study, I'm thinking of the somewhat formal atmosphere of the classroom, we are inevitably going to be discussing. And at that point, we can think about and evaluate the choices made by these characters in a way that I would hope as an English teacher is helpful in students' lives, and that allows them in similar situations to remember the nature of the discussions that were held, and to be in touch with those qualities that they did end up embracing out of that discussion or clarifying for themselves.
I suppose there's a certain respect both for individuals and group process in that approach, isn't it? I mean, there is the sense that as people would wrestle with the text and as groups would discuss it, that out of it a certain truth would emerge, that people would see beneath the surface, or that they wouldn't be taken in by facile answers. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of respect needed for the reader in this kind of situation. It says, well, just because someone is painted in a relatively favorable light and indulges in immoral behavior doesn't mean that one is going to just say, that's what I should do. In other words, we would like to think that through a process of learning and discussion and self-reflection that we could move beyond that and maybe say, well, there's an enticing aspect to that, and I know that within myself, but there are other aspects as well. There's a sense of responsibility that would tell me not to live like that. So, I mean, I like your point. It's really an educative moment, isn't it? It's to take
That's
a
right.
text and to say, by probing it, by discussing it, that all of us can come to a better sense of what morality is all about.
That's right. And I might just pause to say perhaps a lot of people would be concerned with your use of the word truth, because our truth, or our embracing of perhaps a common set of values, is not necessarily going to be shared by all of our students or by all of the readers of the work. And a reader might well decide that he or she agrees with what is hedonistic or selfish in the behavior of one of the characters. And to that degree that we must be respectful of them. We cannot jam down their throats our interpretation, our evaluation, and say, no, 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 no. This was included to show how terrible this kind of behavior is.
Mm-hmm.
We must allow the freedom for the individual reader to determine whether or not to admire or not admire.
I think that this whole discussion of morality can move to a deeper level as well, in terms not just of yes or no to individual acts, whether the book sort of glorifies premarital sex or racist attitudes or whatever. I mean, it seems to me that there's some larger question of moral vision that's involved. I think the great writers, the classic works, have what we're going to call a moral vision, a sense of what is right and wrong in the whole universe of things, that there's a way in which one ought to fit in, there's a structure to reality, and that one ought to try to be able to make sense of that. Although I realize there's a lot of modern literature that would be more nihilistic than that would just think that there was nothing that was absolute or that you could hold on to. So, I mean, but while I'm admitting that, it seems to me, too, there is raised the question through literature, the question of a moral universe, of a whole outlook on life and not just
Yes.
individual behaviors. So maybe we could begin to wrestle with that a little bit. Let's just take the Scarlet Letter, for example. We've got a moral universe there, right? And it feels to us so suffocating today, probably, to live in a Puritan society, a theocratic society in which all behaviors are carefully monitored and people don't seem to have much privacy, and where private sins are sort of brought out publicly, all of that, Hester Prynne's Scarlet Letter. I mean, that creates a world, doesn't it? I mean, I think when we would read that world today, we would say, wow, that's an enclosed, almost suffocating kind of world. On the other hand, it's a world in which sinful behavior has consequences, and one has to try to deal with that. But I just raise that up as a classic work that seems to me to create a moral universe that one would then have to evaluate.
That's right. And I think perhaps the important discussion, or some of the important discussions out of the Scarlet Letter, tend to tilt on evaluating the relative behavior of Hester Prynne, who has a love child by the local minister, and that of her husband Roger Chillingworth, who wishes to get revenge. First of all, to discover the father of his wife's child, and secondly, to get revenge, and pursues in a very cold-blooded, calculating way the eventual, what turns into physical as well as moral demise of Arthur Dimmesdale. And it's hard not to escape a strong sense that the sin of passion done with real love is far less significant, far less weighty in the eyes of the God of this moral universe than that, in fact, of Roger Chillingworth, whose own life has been in other ways upright and good.
So, in other words, when you would, when a student would read this today, or anybody's rereading the Scarlet Letter, what you're saying is that one would have a perception that this sort of self-righteous behavior taken to extreme is going to cause difficulty. You could almost say, well, it challenges my own self-righteousness, or reminds me that often people who live with passion are somehow living closer to the Lord than people who live out of a certain legalism or self-righteous attitude. And then it takes you back to the gospel, so you say, well, that sounds more like Jesus
yes,
than,
it does.
than who
does.
Seemed to condemn self-righteous behavior and seemed to deal better with people who were involved in sins of passion.
That's right. I think you're exactly right there. I think Thomas used to distinguish between sins of passion and sins of reason, or intellectual sins, and he absolutely pegged the intellectual sins as more serious because they are more calculating, more cold-blooded, more premeditated than the sin that comes out of some sweeping and overpowering emotion.
Let's talk about another moral universe, though. That could we take something like John Updike's Couples, or some of Updike's works, or some other book that you want to deal with, where you can sort of where you got a relativistic moral universe, or maybe just the opposite of what you're going to find in the Scarlet Letter. If you don't like Updike's Couples, maybe pick another one that does the same sort of thing, where it's relative, where it seems like there are no values, where characters are just living however they want, and maybe there's very little judgment upon them, and so on. What would be an example in your mind along that line?
Well, I suppose we could take Bonfire of the Vanities by Thomas Wolfe, which was recently
made a movie out of that.
That's right. Although there's judgment insofar as the tone of it is ironic and clearly
set in New York, right?
That's
and
right.
would give us
That's
a
right.
sense of what's going on in the...
All right. The hero, who calls himself Master of the Universe, has been very successful on Wall Street, so much so that he sees himself almost as a god above any kind of law. And he's married and living in a penthouse very wealthily, but he also has a mistress, and becomes inadvertently involved in the death of a young black adolescent, and spends most of the book trying to evade being identified for that particular deed, but ultimately slipping into his own destruction.
Of course, you do get a moral dimension to
That's
that,
right.
a judgment
That's
sooner or
right.
later. But
it's not
I mean, one
explicit, but
thing
it's implied
Yeah.
because of the ultimate consequences of his actions.
Yes, right.
That's right. That's
Whenever,
right.
I guess, when you get a novel in which, even though someone gets away with something for a long time, and eventually it catches up with them, or eventually there's some retribution of some sort, you probably got an implicit moral judgment at work, or at least that's how the reader is going to hear it. Not so that
That's right. Yeah, I would
eventually
agree with
things
you.
would
And
catch up with
Updike
it.
might well be a good one to take for giving no apparent judgments to the behavior of the characters, of refusing to sort of get involved in evaluating their behavior, simply presenting it, reflecting the world that he apparently was familiar with. So
Mm-hmm.
I would agree that probably Updike would be a good choice.
So, okay, as for this relativistic
That's
world
right.
where the morality is not clear cut and you don't see the clear judgments upon the characters involved. And then I think you probably got a new kind of question when we're dealing with that from a moral viewpoint. We have to ask ourselves, well, then what do you do with that? I mean, it seems to me with the book Couples that I had in mind, for example, the sort of behavior, the sexual behavior that's outside of moral norms ends up, I think, they're implicitly looking bad somehow. While it might be put in a very attractive guise, after a while it's cloying, or it turns out to be meaningless. I suppose one of the questions that's raised in Updike's work is, is there any meaning to all of it? Is whatever is going on in modern suburban America with its quest for money, its denial of death, its sometimes fast-track approach to life, is there really any meaning in all of it? So you get a larger, I suppose, if not moral question, religious question. And maybe I moved us to another topic I don't really want to get into, but I want to stay on the moral dimension here.
Let me come back to that. I think a book like Couples precisely points out the value in discussing literature, or certainly reflecting on it, which we almost cannot not do after we've spent a number of hours with these characters and with their lives. We become really immersed, and they invade our consciousness, and I think they hang with us just as the characters out of soaps do with so many people in the U.S. today. And it seems to me that somehow it's as natural for the human person to make judgments as it is for us to want food, and that we make those judgments out of, out of a lot of sources for making judgments. Certainly our religious tradition would be one. The values we have embraced in various ways because of our own experiences would be another. And so authors often, I think, shy away from the evaluation, the sense of evaluation, out of a fear of becoming didactic, but in fact are saying, okay, look at it, what do you think? This is how it is. One
of the important things I got out of what you just said is that the reader brings a moral dimension to the work. In other words, you don't come at it with a blank slate. You come out of it growing up in a family, or parents giving you certain values, living in a neighborhood, living in a religious tradition, attending church, and so on. You come at it with a moral universe already staked out in some sense. And one of the things I would think valuable in reading those authors whose moral universe is very relativistic is that it lets you look back on your own and say, perhaps you see some of the stability in it or the wisdom in the tradition, and you say, aha, that's sort of valuable to me. I'm not as rudderless as those people in the novel. I'm not as prone to chaos in my life. I have something to guide me. It would seem to me that interplay between the moral universe of the reader and that depicted by the author would be an important part of this, and good to see that interplay. So very often I would say, even if evil is portrayed in a sort of attractive way, or even if the moral universe is totally relativistic, it might have some good effect on you. It helps you to sharpen your own moral discourse and see perhaps values in your own moral outlook.
And experience, as you suggested, a new gratitude for having a framework out of which to make those decisions that we have seen made rather impulsively in many cases, or simply because of passions or for other reasons.
Pat, how about Mark Twain's book Huckleberry Finn, and the moments of revelation that we find in that, the moments of really great moral moment, I think is, I never can remember the words exactly, but Huck and Jim are going, Jim the runaway slave is going down the river, and at some point Huck realizes that he ought to turn him in. That's his moral obligation. But he's become friends with Jim, and there's something deeper in him that resonates that says, I can't turn him in. It isn't right. It's not morally correct. And so he decides, I'm not going to turn him in, even though I'm going to be damned for it, even though I'm going to be punished. I'm being morally wrong. I think that's a marvelous point in Mark Twain's book Huckleberry Finn that brings out this whole, this complex moral question that we can get involved in.
You're right. He had written a letter admitting that Tom was with him, and then he tears it up.
Jim was with him?
Jim, I'm sorry. I knew Tom wasn't.
Yes, this is Huckleberry.
I believed on that. Huckleberry Finn, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. And we're talking about Huck.
Huck
as
wrote
in
a letter,
Huckleberry,
yes.
right. He had written a letter, and he was going to admit, finally, that Jim was with him. But at the last moment, he can't do it, and he rips the letter into shreds, and his great line is probably the pivotal line, really, from a moral standpoint in the entire novel, is, "All right, then, I'll go to hell."
Yes, yeah. I mean, that really captures it. So he is following his inner conscience. He's following the moral dictates of his heart. And in doing so, the reader is brought up against the fact of how easily we can get involved simply in peer pressure, in a legalistic morality, and simply following social customs, and how even religious traditions could really lead us in a bad direction here. This is a swipe by Mark Twain at some sort of traditional conventional Christian outlook here. And so it seems to me what happens to the reader is you're caught up short in dealing with this.
I think it's important that it brings out to us that there often is a conflict between what we see as the moral law of God and what is embraced by the law, that what is legal is not necessarily always moral.
Well put. I think that's a good point. Well, Pat, we've been talking about the dialogue between religion and literature and taking up the moral dimension of all of this. I think we've seen that, indeed, it represents a problem for some church people, at least, when people are reading books in which immorality is put in a favorable light, or where there is a rather relativistic worldview presented, and some Christians feel that that's a problem. On the other hand, believers can get a lot out of literature. We can be reminded of the virtues lived by important people. We can be reminded that in having a religious tradition that it offers us great stability. And so it seems to me the dialogue really is enriched, and both sides can learn more about this moral dimension.
Mm.